Gemara is unlike, and you could substitute Chumash, or you could substitute any, but in the classic yeshiva sense, Gemara is everything, and it was unlike. It had a taste that was unlike any other subject. I don't know if you have the same experience.
Hi, I'm Hillel Rapp, and welcome to the inaugural episode of JEDCast, where I look to have unscripted conversations about issues impacting Jewish education. In this episode, Rabbi Yosef, Kurtz, and I talk about an article entitled The Problem with Jewish Education by Minette Mayberg, published in the Jewish Journal in 2018. The article is linked in the show notes, but here is a brief summary. For Minette, the pressing problem for Jewish education is that it is structured in the same way as a secular or general studies education. Mayberg writes, quote, "A secular education model is based on accomplishment, as it should be. When we go out into the work world, our salaries and promotions are based on how well we succeed in achieving stated goals," end quote. So, according to Mayberg, if students earn poor marks in their secular learning, that is fundamentally appropriate, as it reveals where their weaknesses lie, allowing them to specialize appropriately as they advance through the educational system. Jewish education, Mayberg argues, is fundamentally different. Quote, "Unlike the secular model of reward based on measurable overt accomplishment, the goal of learning Torah is very different," end quote. Here she cites the Mishnah in Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers, that the reward for learning Torah is commensurate with the effort one puts in, not the results one takes out. The reward is the study itself and not the measurement of your accomplishment. In this view, a secular education rightly evolves within a context of competition and measured success. Jewish education, by contrast, ought to evolve from a premise of participation and effort without a focus on competitive outcomes. Again, here's Mayberg. There's no value in comparing one to another when it comes to Jewish studies. Yes, there are skills to acquire, but ultimately, the prize is happiness generated by internal growth, understanding of one's mission in the world, and connection to our Creator. Mayberg admits she doesn't know how we got here in Jewish schools. It seems out of sync with the Jewish propensity toward thought leadership and innovation. Further, Jewish survival was built on an uncompromising approach to our ideals and not by co-opting secular methodologies into Jewish education. To address this problem, Mayberg suggests nothing short of a reimagining of Jewish learning in day schools. Quote, "We need to shout from the rooftops that the Jewish souls we hand over to our schools are our future and need to be handled with the utmost care. Support for innovative thinkers in the Jewish education field must replace support for the status quo. We need to urgently encourage innovators to come forward with new models for Jewish learning," end quote. In short, the system of Jewish education is broken and needs to be rebuilt with a new set of assumptions guiding what success is. So here's how Yosef and I unpack this idea. I hope you enjoy listening. This wine's good. Did a nice job. I feel like it has to breathe a little bit.
Yeah.
But you did a nice job. So basically the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to do like a summary of the article, like that I record and attach to the beginning of the episode. So that's where I'll say who you are and whatever. I'm not doing any fancy introductions with your bio or anything like that. I'll put that in episode notes. I mean, nobody's listening to this. It doesn't matter anyway. The goal for me, in doing this is always the conversation itself. I don't care if we get people to listen. I feel like these conversations are missing from my life. So
Great.
This is the way to get them. All right. So, hi Yosef, how you doing?
Good. How you doing, Hillel?
I'm doing good. Thank you. It's great to have you here in my office. Do you know when I put this podcast in my office and then I was like, should I put it away? And I'm like, you know what? It's not really doing anything. So everyone walks in now. It's like, oh, are you recording a podcast? So do you remember that Seinfeld with the Merv Griffin episode?
Merv Griffin, yeah.
Yeah, when he gets the
Kramer,
set.
yeah.
And I'm like, that's what I feel like. Everyone who comes in for a meeting is just going to be like, hey, you're on the podcast.
You got to bring out surprise guests. We start talking about someone. Well, look who's what.
Right. What was the one where he calls someone? He's like, let's see what is Jerry's girlfriend or something?
It's the episode where Jerry's drugging his girlfriend and playing with her toys at night. her retro toys. Right. And so he gets her to talk about it, and then he says, "Well, we got it right here."
Jerry Springer style.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, what did you think of the article?
I didn't love it.
Yeah, I'm surprised. I thought you'd like it more than I did.
To be honest, I thought you'd think I liked it more than you did. But there was a piece of it that I appreciated, that I understood where she was coming from in her writing. But there was definitely an element of it that the economist in me, my background in finance, like hated. And there was an element of me that the rabbi in me hated. I hate maybe a strong word, but that I really didn't enjoy about her writing. Let's start with the part that I liked. I appreciate the fact that treating Judaics like any other subject does a disservice to the fact that Judaics is not a subject, but it's a way of life. It's everything to us. And so I can appreciate where she was coming from in that regard, is that if you go to a school where Gemara, for example, I think Gemara is a great example in classic boys' yeshivas. When I was growing up, you daven Shachris, and then your Rebbe is with you for 2-3 hours every morning. You're going to do a little Gemara, you're going to do some Chumash, some Musar, but that Rebbe is going to be your guide to everything in life. He's there. Gemara is unlike, and you could substitute Chumash, or you could substitute any, but in the classic yeshiva sense, Gemara is everything, and it was unlike. It had a taste that was unlike any other subject. I don't know if you had the same experience.
Well, I mean, Gemara was central to my education, but I wouldn't say I felt. Look, I would say in primary school, I felt like my Rebbe was really important. I remember as a little kid, wanting. I mean, when I had good Rebbeim, I also had really weird Rebbeim too. I was the last group in Tiferes Moshe, where I went to elementary school, that still had Holocaust Rebbeim. Like Holocaust survivors, where they were you're messed up from being in the concentration camps, so you should teach children. That was I was the last, we still had a couple of those. And then I remember hearing a few years after I left elementary school that they cleaned house, and they brought in all these young Chafetz Chaim guys, and it was they totally revamped the whole thing. So some of them were not nice, in any way. But the ones who were, it was an incredible experience. As a little boy, I mean, this is my pet peeve with modern Orthodox Judaic studies in elementary school is that boys don't have religious male role models until middle school, maybe. Right. And I think that, I think the education system systemically discriminates against boys in so many ways, just the structure of it and all the expectations and so on. It's even more so if all the Torah learning they have is from women when they're little kids. I just think that's not good. So I remember having really good experiences with Rebbeim that were positive. High school, less so. That might be idiosyncratic to my experience, but definitely less so. But it was so, because I was in sort of the yeshiva world growing up, a Rebbe was always just a thing that I assumed I would have, right? When I went to Israel, I tried to be really close with Reb Lachman and KBY because I was supposed to have a Rebbe, right? There was all those experiences. So yeah, I think that was part of the culture. Anyway, so you were saying.
Yeah, so I remember when I was a kid at one point, and I came from a home with a very learned father who was also a scientist. He was a biomedical engineer. And one time, maybe it was in 9th grade, that I came home and I expressed to my father that I had science homework, so I didn't have time to learn Gemara. And he said something along what do you mean you don't have time to learn Gemara? And I said, well, I need to focus on the subject that I'm going to need for life. And it was the worst thing I could have said to my father. So what do you mean? He said, I use science every day. Science is my parnasa, but Gemara is life. This is going to guide you forever. And I was, in high school, I did have mostly phenomenal Rebbeim, and I did have that experience of setting, and not just Gemara, but setting Judaics aside as being a different subject. Even though you had tests, which were, criticized in the article, even though you had assessments and benchmarks and standards, and you certainly had somewhat of a rigorous program. I wouldn't say the assessments were so hard, but I did have a overall positive Judaic experience with that, and I appreciate the fact that many modern Orthodox schools have moved away from that model. And when you signal to students that Gemara or Chumash is a class like any other, it signals to them that this is a subject and not something different, not our life. Kihem chayenu ve'orech yameinu, which is like, this is Torah is our life, and what sustains us forever. And so I appreciate that about the article, certainly. And
it's interesting because I didn't read it sounds to me like you're picking up on her critique of Limudei Kodesh or Judaic studies education as being too rigorous and structured and academically oriented, right? Whereas, and you then turn that into it, it was better when you had a Rebbe, right? But that's not sort of where she's going with it. It doesn't seem like to me.
Where do you think she's going with it?
Yeah. So I'm not sure actually. This to me is the sort of defining paragraph of the article where she says the secular education model is built on accomplishment as it should be, right? And so it's like there's this differentiation between secular education where it being a meritocracy of achievement, right, is understandable. Whereas in the Limudei Kodesh education, it shouldn't be a meritocracy of achievement because you get rewarded for, when you learn Torah, you get rewarded for the effort, not for the result necessarily. And so we should just be, I think what she's saying is celebrating the effort. Right. And maybe in that sense, you're touching on when you have a Rebbe, you feel like you're validated and you're good, right? Even if you're not getting 90s or 100 in the class, right? Like a good Rebbe will have the ability to take the student who's earning 60s and 70s or even 50s and make them feel valued. Right. So I think maybe it's more connected than I originally thought.
I remember my Rebbe in high school would read out the results of every test. And he'd go through the class like Avram, 110. It was pretty hard to get less than 110. There was always a bonus. Shloimi, 110. And then there was one kid who didn't do well. Always, let's call him Chaim. You get to Chaim and say, Chaim. And he'd pause, and we'd all look, all eyes on Chaim. And he'd say, means well. And then he'd move on, just like Yosef, 110. And, he really, so maybe that was not the best system, I admittedly.
You know what, though? We all turned out all right.
We all turned out all right.
Although maybe not Chaim.
Maybe not Chaim.
Maybe Chaim's in a ditch somewhere.
Let's hope not. I actually have not seen him since he meant well in 10th grade. But I can understand where you're coming from. I just also, I also think that there is a limit to this concept of lefum tzara agra, of you're rewarded based on your effort. And when I say there's a limit, I don't mean in Shemayim. I mean here on earth. If someone struggles their whole life and learns and just can't get it, likely they'll leave the yeshiva system. Right. Hopefully they can find a productive and meaningful place in our Frum community. For example, there are people that can't fit in yeshiva, but they're the heads of Hatzalah, but they're on Chaverim, but they're saving lives, philanthropists, they're in business. 100%. My point being, though, in terms of Torah scholarship, if someone is not a Talmud Chacham, they're referred to as an Am Haaretz, or they're ignorant in Torah. Nobody's going to them for religious advice or for Torah advice. So I understand the point, but I took it that way because I don't believe we're truly, we ever could truly live in an effort-based system with Torah learning. Maybe that's an ideal world. There's a story in the book of Rav Moshe Feinstein about him stopping the learning in the base medrash and making a huge siyum for a guy that spent 3 months learning one amud of Gemara, which is phenomenal. Is Rav Moshe consulting him on his next psak, halacha, like on his next, halachic verdict about, what he should do in terms of like that Amud Gemara? Probably not. So it's very nice, and we should celebrate that. And maybe her point is, let's do more of Rav Moshe Feinstein. I just, I think there's a limit to that, and so that's where my comment was coming from. That when we're not effort rewarding and we're merit rewarding, so then it becomes like every other subject that we are merit rewarding. So that's how I read it, but I understand your point.
I had the same note in a little bit of a different way, which is like, I don't think anyone, like, to me, I have a bigger picture critique of this, which I'll share in a second, but just to focus on that one point about effort versus accomplishment, I don't think anyone can just continually put effort into something without feeling a sense of accomplishment and it be enough. Right? Like, to your example of Means Well, right? Like it probably didn't feel good for Means Well, even if your Rebbe didn't single him out, right? Like it's like at some point, you don't just feel good with the effort, right? Like when you're a little kid, that might be the case. Like, when you're a little kid, you don't really understand accomplishment yet, maybe. Right? Although you get it pretty quickly in school, right? Like at some point you have to feel like you're accomplishing. And that brings me to, I think, my larger critique of the article, which is that I think she's diagnosing a problem with school, not a problem with Judaic studies versus general studies. The problem, it starts with this: what's the goal of school? So if the goal of school is how I think she describes a general studies program or a secular education, if the goal of school is it's just a giant meritocracy and it's a sorting mechanism for the global economy, right? And so it's meant to basically take the top 20% and label them as the best and make everyone some degree of removed from the best. Okay, then I guess, that then everything holds up. But like, is that really what the goal of school should be? Like, we mandate that everyone go to school.
Right.
Are we mandating everyone go to school so that 80% of them cannot fully succeed at the endeavor, right? Because I think it's generous to say 20% of students master school top to bottom. Right? So everyone who's not in that full mastery place is failing to some degree or another, right? Maybe not terribly, but is not fully succeeding and fully mastering. So I would have a different approach to what school is. I think school should be a project of learning, right? And you engage with learning in school. And through that engagement with learning, you become self-aware of how you learn, right? And if you do that, then in an ideal world, close to 100% of graduates from school feel successful in the sense that I have learned how I learn. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone takes calculus and gets A's in calculus, right? It doesn't mean that everyone is an Eloi and a genius in Gemara and doing everything they're the guy Rav Moshe is going to ask his shaila to. It means that everyone engages with the process and finds what their markers of success are, and is able to know what they need to do to accomplish those markers of success. Now, I don't think our current school system is structured that way, and there's reasons for that. I mean, part of the reason it's not structured that way is because everyone has to matriculate annually on some calendar date, right? And so, if one student can get things in the time frame allotted, great, they get their A. And if another student needs to take longer, either because their learning style is different or because they just didn't put an effort and then they woke up late and they didn't do it, we just move everyone along, right, year by year. And so inevitably people fall behind. If we took an approach of everything you learn, you're meant to master. And if you don't master it, you don't leave it, you keep at it. And if you want to leave it, you're making a conscious choice to leave it. So let's like put it in a high school reality, right? Like if I'm taking, algebra, right? And it takes the average student, I don't know, 3 weeks to master specific concepts, right? But I don't get it in 3 weeks. So I stick with it. Maybe it takes me 6 weeks. Maybe it takes me 9 weeks. Maybe at some point I turn to the school and to my parents and say, I'm done. I don't want to do this. Okay. All of that is self-aware, right? Meaning either I have now learned how to do this process and how it's taken me longer and why it's taken me longer and what I can do next time, maybe to improve my time. Or I've decided consciously I want to leave this behind and focus on something else. But that's not the way school actually works. The way school actually works is we put the student in a class. Everyone has to learn it in 3 weeks. Those who get it, get it. Those who don't, just don't get it. And there's no moments of self-awareness of why didn't I get it? What would it take for me to get this? What kind of effort would I have to put into it, right? So I think if you reimagine school entirely, where you didn't have this annual matriculation and these time frames that you have to put on, and the fact that you reduce every single subject to a single numerical value, right? Like if you looked at education more holistically, which there are schools, no Jewish schools that I'm aware of, but there are schools out there that do this, that do sort of a learning to mastery approach. If you looked at it that way, then does that change her criticism, right? Because now, like, is the criticism that fundamentally Jewish learning is not accomplishment oriented, right? And it should be something else? Or is her criticism that the traditional structure of school and how it understands accomplishment means that Jewish education becomes something that's not enjoyable and distasteful, which is equally true for math if you have trouble with math, and equally true for science if you have trouble with science. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah. That resonates. I can understand that.
Right. So let's get into that for a second. And I think this is, to me, the more fundamental tension, right? Which I thought she would touch on, but she doesn't touch on as much, which is Jewish education does have a dual goal that secular education does not, right? In the secular world, the goal is purely, let's say, cognitive, right? You're meant to develop a certain cognitive ability, awareness, sensitivity to a set of processes, a set of information, a type of analysis, something like that. And maybe it serves you well in your life, in your career, and so on. In Jewish education, there is that cognitive element, but there is also this identity element.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what I found interesting, because like at one point at the end of the article, she says that she says like shame on us refrain. She says, double shame on us that we put our future at stake by tacitly accepting less than optimal conveyance of an optimal curriculum, right? And my question is, was the project of Jewish education ever about curriculum? Like, why do we send kids to Jewish schools?
So it's a great question, and this brings me to the next point I was going to talk about. One of the two major things that I didn't love about the article. So I'm currently writing a dissertation for my doctorate on the effect that parents have on their children's religious identity and basically religious consistency later on in young adulthood, from their performance of the positive attitude and performance of their actions with their children at a young age. So I know that sounded very confusing and complex.
It sounds like a dissertation title.
But it's essentially, if you dive in...
What will get a greater audience, this podcast or your dissertation?
My dissertation, it will have a viewership of one, or the committee. I don't even know if they'll read it. Why you? I hope they don't. I hope
nobody's listening.
I hope the dean doesn't listen to this podcast. I think that basically, if you dive in and you learn with your kids at a young age, and you give them a positive experience through those religious rituals, will they then have a greater likelihood of being religiously consistent with their parents later on in life, when they're 18, when they're 19 and 20. That's what I'm studying. Now, the research, and this article was anecdotal, which I have no problem with. Most articles are anecdotal, and it's an op-ed and no problem. But the research overwhelmingly shows that religious engagement, the biggest contributors to religious engagement in children is their parents. Without, it's very hard to find research that supports that Rebbeim and teachers are responsible for the religious engagement of their students. Now, what I'm getting at is as follows, that the article is implying, perhaps maybe stating outright, that my children are not religiously engaged because the system is bad. Now, your question was, why do we send our kids to Jewish school? I would double ask the question is, if parents are responsible for religious engagement, why are we spending $30,000, $25,000, $20,000 a year sending our kids to Jewish school when the parents are responsible for, if the parents do their job, the kids will turn out religiously engaged? Now, I believe that there are a few factors why we invest in Jewish education. We invest in Jewish education so that our children will have Jewish friends. We invest in Jewish education because we send our kids to school because we don't have the ability to teach them Torah and to teach them math and to teach them science all day. So we pay for school to do that for us. We pay for a Rabbi to do that for us. To imply that a merit-based curriculum is responsible for my child not being religiously engaged, while that could be true, it's very rare in the research done about why people go off the derech and stop being religiously engaged. It's very rare. Now, sometimes they'll blame a Rebbe, but it's very rare that it would be because I got a bad mark on a test, because I failed Gemara. Now, it is possible to happen, but I don't think that the research really supports that.
Okay, but let me make the charitable version. Let me steelman her position for a moment, right? Because I think that you know, if you look at it in these sort of extremes of like not being religiously engaged at all, going off the derech, whatever you want to call it, versus being engaged, sure, you're right. Like at the end of the day, I don't think that, you know, because you were tested, that's what made you go off the derech. But if we're just talking about general sense of excitement, enthusiasm, engagement with Judaism, and seeing the hours of the day that you invest in this project as a fruitful use of time, I would say most Jewish high school students in the modern Orthodox Jewish world just are not meaningfully engaged Jewishly with Jewish content. Right. And again, maybe that's not the goal. Like, I have a thought on that, but I want to let you answer this first. Like, I just think like we could take this criticism on a less extreme level and just say like, okay, are we making them like, is Judaic studies exciting in high school? Let's say.
Right. And I understand that anecdotally the answer could be no. Now, the question is then, let's look at a model of when Judaic studies could be exciting, or who is fired up by their Judaic studies. Let me explain what I mean. I would say if you go to you leave the modern Orthodox world and you go to a Haredi yeshiva where they're spending 5, 6, 8 hours a day learning Gemara, hopefully, I mean, the hope is that there's enthusiasm for the subject. They're debating. They're engaging with the subject on a level that we're not achieving. Perhaps, I hope that's fair to say, but I think if you walk into your average modern Orthodox school, you just won't have that same level of engagement with the Gemara that you would in a place where they're spending.
I have a take on. So yes, yeah. I and look, I went to, let's say, yeshivish places, right? Yeah. Like, you know, I wouldn't call Yesodi Yeshurin like the most yeshivish, right? Like it's, you know, they took their general studies seriously. Right. It wasn't a joke. But you know, there was yeshiva. We had, you know, Gemara basically till 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I think there are two aspects to the success that the yeshiva world has of engaging high school students with excitement in their learning, which they do broadly, right? That they definitely are successful at that. One is what you're describing, which is Gemara is such an complicated and intricate endeavor that if you don't, and this actually starts in elementary school, if you don't start learning Gemara in grade 5, right? Ideally even in grade 4, right? But let's say at least in grade 5, and drill on those skills, right? The way good yeshivish schools drill on Gemara skills. So by the time you're in middle school and you need to be engaged, right? You're not, your sense of navigating school is moving away from rote learning, right? You already have some skills in your pocket. And my faher for high school, right? My entrance test for high school was to just read a page of Gemara, right? And show and demonstrate that I could navigate a page of Gemara at 14 years old. That required a grounding in skills. Now, what that means is by the time I get to high school, I actually can start learning Rishonim. I can start having abstract conversations. I have a sense of the Gemara in a deeper and richer way, which itself makes the learning endeavor more meaningful. Modern Orthodox schools fail at this completely because what they do is they don't start Gemara until middle school. They try to drill on skills in middle school. That's so boring for your average, 12 to 13-year-old. And so there's very little engagement. So the students don't get the skills, right? And then by the time they get to high school, they don't have those skills. They can't engage in the abstract conversations and you kind of lost them, right? And unless then they get later motivated by yeshiva in Israel and other motivators, they kind of don't ever really get into Gemara learning. That's factor number one, I think. Factor number two, though, and this can't be underscored, is that the yeshiva world turns learning, and especially the external trappings around learning, into social currency, right? So in that world, if you're a learner, if you have a smada, if you go out at night and you're studying Torah in a beis medrash, that's people talk about you. Your parents are proud of you. There's this whole communal cultural sense, and it feeds into shidduchim and that whole culture. It's just there's a value placed on Torah learning socially as a social currency. So that pushes kids in high school to want to make a siyum and want to finish Masechtos and want to be known as that kid. There's this whole sort of cycle of social positivity. Modern Orthodox world generally doesn't have that. There really isn't much social currency to limud Torah. So I think that to me is an equally important role there. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I believe in that very strongly. I think that in our community we have, and this is a little bit self-serving, but we don't have enough respect for rabbis, for Rabbeim, for Talmidei Chachamim. We have respect for philanthropists and for money and for power and maybe that's overly critical sometimes for good things also, for people who are doctors who save lives. And the more we sit around our Shabbos tables and criticize our schools and criticize the rabbis and go on and on, the more that plays into our education of our children, teaching them that Torah is not what to be respected. And what do I want for my child? I want my child to be successful, whether it is a doctor, a lawyer, businessman, or etc. I think that very strongly we have to fix that in our community. I think
but there's a dark underside to the yeshiva world's approach also.
You're right.
Right? Because in the yeshiva world, because you've made limud Torah the pinnacle of social accomplishment, anyone who can't learn, like you mentioned before, there's a place for there's a place for people who want to be Hatzalah. I think in the modern Orthodox world that's fine. Like if you become a successful plumber and want a successful, wonderful, right? But in yeshiva world, oh no, right? There's an underside to that also.
Perhaps, and I don't know, I've never researched or done studies on this. Perhaps the happy middle ground is the Sephardi community. I think I one time ran an NCSY trip for primarily Sephardi students, and every time I called a parent, the parent would answer, "Yes, Kvod Rav, yes, yes."
You know that Modi skit, right? About you ever watch that one where he does Ashkenazim, Sephardim with Rav, this Rav, he knows everything. Ashkenazim, what the heck does that guy know?
Exactly, and I showed up at the airport and the Sephardi parents brought me gifts. A mother brought me homemade Persian stew or something like that. And really, like, it was beautiful, and they value, and they do value different things, but they have a sense in their community of kavod for Torah, and kavod for Torah scholars, and in the Haredi community they have it, and we could do a better job. And I know that it's self-serving as a Rebbe, to say, oh, I should be more respected. But I even remember as a child, and maybe I should stop myself. But no, I'll be distant enough with the information that I won't reveal. But I even remember as a child that I went to someone's house on Shabbos, and the entire meal they sat there complaining about the Rebbeim, the school, the yeshiva, how bad they were, how bad the school was. And I hated going to this family's house for Shabbos. And I made a comment to my parents, I don't want to go there anymore because I view it as being so negative. I don't want to go to someone's house where all they're doing is complaining about my school, about how bad it is, how bad the Rebbeim are. I like my school. I like the Rebbeim. I like the Rosh Yeshiva. So like, I'm going to sit there and they're going to criticize. I don't know, everything that goes into the factors of why people choose to be religious or not, or be engaged or not. But I don't think it's helpful to sit there being so negative and critical. You don't have to be blind to some of the problems in your community and some of the problems with the Rebbeim. I had a bad Rebbe, and I know at some point you did too, and probably most people did, but I had a bad Rebbe, and it's actually like he turned me off, and I didn't enjoy it, and I hated being in his class, and it was a tough year. Just a few months ago, 2-3 months, at the beginning of the summer, he came up to me in a grocery store. I don't know what he does now. I think he left cleanup, but he came up to me in a grocery store and he apologized. He said, "I'm so sorry if I ever did anything that was wrong to you. I felt like there were certain things I didn't act appropriately. I see you turned out all right." And,
wow,
yada, yada.
It's really sitting with this guy.
Yeah. And I said, no, of course, no need to be mochel, and like, there's nothing you ever did, and 100%. And
then he walked away, and you're like, jerk.
No, I actually I very much appreciated the sentiment, and I think I forgave him at the end of the year. Like by the end of the year, I think we were good. There were a lot of bumps along the way. Now that's still like, again, I don't know why people make I don't know every factor that goes into why people make the religious decisions they do. I think a lot of research is being done right now by the OU, by YU, about why people go off the derech and the reasons they say versus the reasons they do, and maybe some of the underlying reasons that contribute to those decisions. I'm not here to talk about that.
I'm so curious, like, what the result of that is going to be. There's a genuine lack of study on this stuff. Like, most of the studies are kind of silly.
The OU just commissioned a massive study.
Yeah.
It started with a qualitative study of about 30 people were interviewed. And it's going to lead then to a quantitative study looking at it further. There were some surprising results. One of the results that was shared, and it was shared publicly, so it's not anything I happen to have.
You heard it here for the first time.
I think it's been publicized, may have even been written about in Mishpacha, who knows. But Rabbi Hauer from the OU talked about this. He's in charge of these research projects. And he talked about the importance people placed on their communal rabbis and being turned off by that, and perhaps being turned on by their, turned on religiously by their communal rabbis. And again, can't...
Meaning in both directions.
Yeah.
The communal rabbi. It's so interesting because when I was youth director at the Young Israel of Kew Gardens Hills, when I was in YU, the rabbi at the time was Rabbi Schoenfeld, Rabbi Fabian Schoenfeld. I think his son took over afterwards. I'm not sure if he's still the rabbi there. Anyway, so he was an older man even then, and he said to me that he resented that kids who grew up in the shul their entire lives, right, who he's, been with their family through thick and thin, would go off to Israel and spend a year in yeshiva and then get engaged and like fly in their Rebbe from Israel to be Masader Kedushin at the wedding. And like that shift that he saw in his time as a rabbi bothered him.
Right. It's funny that you say that, because when I introduced this concept, I said there was a result that was surprising. I thought that the results would show that communal rabbis are less and less relevant than they were. But the research showed that that's not true. That communal rabbis were, actually very significant in people's religious identity. But I see that all the time. People fly in their rebbeim, and I see people developing those relationships. And especially in very large shuls, I don't know the membership at Kew Garden Hills in Young Israel, but you look at a shul that has 5, 6, 7, 800 families, and we have these mega shuls today. How easy is it for a teenager to build a relationship with a pulpit rabbi? I actually just heard from one of our students last year who was in yeshiva. They were walking on Ben Yehuda, and a rav of a very big shul came over to them, hugged and kissed them, and said, "Come here, sit at the table. I saved you a seat right next to me." Now, the boy sat down and realized it was a reunion for this rabbi's shul. And this rabbi thought he was a member of the shul. He just happened to be in the same restaurant at the same time. The rabbi didn't know who he was. He just hugged this guy, said, "Oh, this teenager came. He must be a member of my shul." Sat him down in the seat next to me. Said, "Oh, I saved you this seat. I want to hear all about your year in yeshiva. Regards from your parents and your grandparents," whatever. Goes on and on.
How long till?
And the kid was sitting there, and at some point just got up and snuck out and said, like, "Wait, I'm not supposed to be here." Yeah, how easy is it?
It's a great story.
Yeah, it was really funny. And how easy is it to really develop that connection with the pulpit rabbi? But again, it was surprising. So it's hard to know. It's hard to know the true impact of a rebbe, because, as I said, I really do believe in. I've invested my life into being a mechanech because I view it as being so important. Yet I just said that the parents play such an important role. I don't think the rebbe doesn't play a role. I think the rebbe's role is incredibly important. Just an hour ago, before I came here, I got a phone call from a mother. She snuck out to her car. She said, "If my son knew I was calling you, he'd kill me," which a lot of my conversations start that way, because people hate when their parents get involved in their life. But she said, "Rabbi, I want to partner with you." That to me is the right methodology. The right way is when the parents partner with the rebbeim, when the parents partner with the schools, and view it in that way. I think then we're gonna engage our children and our students. And I don't know this woman. I don't know that she was doing this even. I don't want to be critical of her. She could be the best mom and the most supportive. And this was just an op-ed to talk about the flaws in our system, which I think do exist. But we all know that there are parents who want to take no responsibility, don't want to wake up for minyan themselves, don't want to emphasize tefillin, they go on vacation and they eat, half kosher, and like they'll eat vegetarian out, and they don't want to emphasize many of the halachos that they want to stress. And then when their child makes decisions that are, let's say, signaling to them that my child isn't engaged, my child is going off the derech, they immediately blame the school. "You call yourself a yeshiva, how dare you, my child isn't engaged." I'm not blaming the parents. What I'm saying is our school system, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamla, who set up the yeshiva system and really mandated that every child should get an education, it needs to be a partnership, because the obligation of educating our children comes to the parent. And the parent says to the Rebbe or to the Mora or to the teacher, "I'm going to hire you to take some of these hours away so I can make a living for my family." But it's a partnership. And the second, I get a sniff of like, "Oh, it's the school and my," then I don't like that. Now, should our schools be better? Yes. Should our rebbeim be better? 100%. I just think that it needs to come in tandem with a true partnership with parents and with community.
Okay, so let's get a little more tachlis oriented here. I want to drill on the question of effort versus skill.
Yeah.
Right? Like the idea of rewarding effort we already talked about is strange, right? Like you can't reward effort endlessly. At some point, effort has to result in some sort of skill acquired, right? So what could Jewish education look like, right? Like what do we want our children? Do we want our children to not, like, this goes with the Daven Bashefkin quote that I quoted in an essay that I wrote, but it was on the podcast with Ephraim Goldberg, where he was like, yeah, kids today, they don't, they're not as fluent in Jewish grammar, and they're not as skilled maybe as high school students 25 years ago, but they are so warm and engaged, and it was, it was a very positive view of the fact that maybe we traded some skills for engagement. Is that the ideal? Like, are skills kind of not the point of Jewish education? Like that thought kind of horrifies me, but is that a worthwhile trade-off? Or do we have to make skills part of Jewish education? If we have to make skills part of it, like if that's the goal, then how do we do that in a way that engages 100% or close to 100% of kids?
Yeah, last year I had a student, and this isn't addressing your entire question. This is kind of keying in on the beginning of your question. But last year I had a student who did not do well on her exam. And she came to me, I gave her her results, and she was crying. And I sat her down and I said to her, nobody will ever ask you in your life how well you did on your grade 10 midterm Chumash exam. Nobody will look at it and think of you as a worse person. Your parents won't remember. Your children won't ask you. Don't worry about the mark. Think about how far you've come. Think to yourself, be self-reflective. Did you try your hardest? Did you push yourself? If the answer's no, then let's work harder for the next time, and we'll raise the mark. You want me to adjust your mark at the end of the year? If you really put in that effort, we'll talk about that. But this number on this page, it doesn't really matter. And she's crying, and she says, yeah, but my parents, I called her parents, and I told them the same thing. I said, nobody will care. I said, your daughter's a mensch. She cares about it. She's passionate about it. So maybe that's what rewarding effort.
Should we have done away with that exam? Like, was that exam a worthwhile effort as an educator?
Yes.
Why?
So what I'm saying is maybe we need more. Maybe we need more ways to signal to our students that the exam does not define who they are. Why do we need tests? I think that assessments in general have merit. They have merit because they encourage our students to study and to review and to hold themselves accountable for their learning.
Okay, but I'm putting my Miss Mayberg hat on, right? That's great. We already have that in math and science and English and history and all of your general study subjects. Why are you doing that to my child in Gemara when the result is tears? Like, how does the young woman in your office feel about herself as a Jewish person?
So then, maybe after the fact, I can rip it up and say, okay, let's do it again. Show me that you're going to put in the effort. Now, why does it have value? I will say that my high school Gemara learned was the best Gemara I learned in my life because I had to study for tests and exams. There was merit in that. I had to review it over and over.
So what you're saying is at the end of the day, if you don't put in the effort, you're not going to take it seriously.
Right. And our students ask us all the time, we're both teachers, how often can't we just learn Lishma? Can't we just learn Lishma? But we know how that goes. How many people come to purely Lishma learning? Some will come. Some will put in the effort. I run a Lishma learning program in the girls' school. And girls come. We have about between 40 and 50 girls that come every week after school, and they learn Lishma. If I tested them and I mandated that they take tests, they would learn better. I think there's value in that.
They would learn better, but a fraction would come.
Yeah.
Maybe none.
Yeah, maybe none. Maybe 3 would come. they would make better use of their time. They come, they eat pizza, they hang out, and they learn a little. I think there's so much value in that. I also think there's value, and at the end of the day, after school that has courses and tests, to be able to learn Torah again and say this is Lishma, that means you're getting the point. That means you're getting that the test doesn't really matter. Who cares about the test? It's encouraging you. It's pushing you to learn a little. If that's not working for you, so then let's figure out something that does work for you. I think that, as the world, as our school system learns more and more about differentiated education and in secular education, like we learn more about being better educators, that not everyone learns the same way. We started off this podcast by talking about how perhaps our school system, and you mentioned this, perhaps our school system should be focused purely on teaching students how they learn best. And if a student finishes a day of school and says, okay, now I know what I enjoy learning, what I don't enjoy learning, but I'm going to come here and say, like, this spoke to me, I want to do more of this. That's beautiful. They're getting the point.
So that's my thought experiment, right? That's the core question that I have about when I constantly hear this argument, right? Because having worked with me, that my orientation is academic, right? Mm-hmm. And the thing I keep hearing in response to that is that's not what's going to engage kids and keep them interested. And my response to that is I don't know, because we've never actually tried a system where close to 100% of kids achieve academic success. Now, that doesn't mean that 100% of kids are mastering calculus or are mastering the highest level of Gemara. But that means that 100% of kids have set goals for themselves and have had a school that works with them until they have fully accomplished those goals and demonstrated that on a test or an assessment of some sort. So if you take now 100% of Jewish day school students who are achieving success, what might that look like? I want my kid to be fluent in Hebrew. That's the goal. Well, if you want to be fluent in Hebrew, you're going to have to work at it, right? First of all, the school is going to have to create some type of immersion environment. There's going to have to be, real investment in writing and reading and language and all of that stuff, right? Now, maybe for the next parent, my goal is I don't need my child to be fluent in Hebrew, but I want my child to have a real sense of Jewish holidays and the rules around Jewish holidays. Okay, so that's the goal. But every effort is going to require some amount of stress, right? But if you were in a system where close to 100% of students were achieving success in the efforts that they engaged in, or if they left an effort, they did it knowingly and self-reflectively, then maybe you would engage students meaningfully. And it wouldn't actually be about, and this is maybe the controversy, it wouldn't be about the kumzits or the singing or the tishes or the food or all the other things that we act as if this is what's keeping kids engaged. And maybe it is, maybe it's not. I'm waiting for the OU study to tell me, right? But at the end of the day, like school as a project is fundamentally, I think, academic, right? And what ends up happening in most Judaic studies programs is maybe we have one or two academic classes and the rest are kind of some loose hodgepodge of assessments that aren't really serious, and teachers who are sitting the kid down when they're crying and saying it's not really doesn't matter. None of this is right. Like trying to save the student from the stress of the assessment. But what if that stress actually saw reward?
Right. I'm gonna address that or respond to that. There's a quote that I've seen attributed probably to 40 different people. And the two most notable were Teddy Roosevelt, and I saw it once on a plaque in someone's office from Rabbi Yosef. That's a good range. Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva of Philadelphia. Okay, that's a big range. Mm-hmm. It's a big range. What's the quote? Is people don't care about what you know until they know how much you care. Now, you want to know what I think is the role of the Rebbe. The role of the Rebbe is to show the student that they care. Genuinely, authentically. Students will know if the Rebbe doesn't really care. If the Rebbe cares, and if the teacher cares in any subject and gives them academic pressure, but they do it and the student knows they're pushing me because they love me, because they care, that will engage the student. That's not the problem. You want to push our students and you want to make it merit-based, but like you tell the student, I'm pushing you because I know you can achieve this, and I care about you, and I love you, and I want you to get there because I know you can do it, the student will fly.
Brother, I would add to that, and I agree with that.
That's my philosophy of education.
I agree with that 100%. And I would add to that, I don't even think it needs to be some like magical, touchy-feely sort of care thing. If you just say to the student, I'm with you until you succeed.
Yeah.
Like, my goal is for you to succeed. And if you don't succeed the first time, I'm with you for the next 30, 40, 50 infinite times till you succeed. Right. And the calendar year is not going to stop our relationship and that sort of thing. I mean, and again, there's economic parameters to structuring this, but I don't think they're insurmountable. That in and of it's just that gesture of I'm with you until you master this.
Right.
Right. And if in the end you give up, that's a conversation we're going to have together, and it's going to be your decision to give up.
Right. And you talk about our testing system. So you give a student an assessment and they don't do well. If you tell the student, okay, like, you didn't do well, you stink, or if they feel they stink at the end,
right?
That's not the point of the assessment. The assessment is, I as a teacher now know what you know and what you don't know, and what skills you've gained and what skills you haven't gained. Now I want to work with you to get better. If I didn't give you this test, if I never knew that you got a 60, because I don't really know how good you are at translation. It doesn't have to be a test. It can be in class. Like, we have these assessments for learning, as learning, of learning. So you give a student a check-in. If I don't do that assessment, I don't know where you are. If I never push you, I'll never know where you are and where I should meet you and where I can work with you to set those goals for the future. So my philosophy as an educator is exactly that, is I want my students to know that I care. I want to push them. I want them to be challenged. Maybe I don't do a good enough job at that. Maybe I should be more challenging. But I don't think that those tests and showing that merit counts is a problem. I don't even think that Mishnah, when it says Lefum Tsar Agra, by the measure of the pain is the reward, meant that. Like, we value effort because we know that true effort will lead to something. And even if it doesn't, there's value in that journey along the way.
It's like the anti-fragile thing, right? Like, if you don't stress the system, if you don't stress the person, then they're just fragile, right? And you have to, and the reverse actually becomes stronger as you stress them, you stress them more.
Right.
I make that argument all the time with I run a very open discussion oriented class, right? And so students are very free and open to share their concerns and their doubts and so on. And that often other students will look at that and be like, why is this student saying they don't believe in God? Or why is the student saying any of those things? And my response is always like, at the end of the day, if we can engage with serious questions, right, then we're sending you out into the world fragile, right? And, we should be confident enough to be, and certainly I think in the modern Orthodox world, for whatever that label's worth, we should be confident enough to engage with those questions and to be able to hear our peers share genuinely what they feel and what their thoughts are, right, and those challenges, and be able to engage with them. But that's not often. Like, I think maybe underlying all of this, I just thought of this, but I think maybe underlying all this also just this like anxiety around like anything. Like, I have parents who call the school, who call me like grade 9, like right away, right? My kid used to sing Zmirot and now they don't sing Zmirot anymore and they're disengaged, right? Or they're going on their phone on Shabbat, or they're doing any of these things. And it's almost like, well, like, slow down. Like, this is a journey. Like, at the end of the day, like, I don't know, like, I went through ups and downs in my life and different, points where I felt engaged or disengaged. And like, there's a journey here, and they're becoming their own people, and they're gonna, like everyone, they're going to engage with, and it's true in the modern Orthodox world, kids they're closer to the edge of the cliff. Like, that's the nature of the world. They're exposed more, and they're engaged with culture more, and there's less of a bubble drawing them in.
Sure.
But like, I think that as that happens, there's more and more anxiety. And if the parents see anything, there's like this immediate fear of like, just make them happy, make them feel engaged. And then maybe a lot of that is just adolescence also. Like, my kid used to be so sweet and little and, sang benching with us every Shabbos. And now they're, off in their room and they don't want to leave, right? Because they're a teenager, and that's what teenagers do.
That's what teenagers do.
Right. Okay, so back to the goal of Jewish education. In your mind, the goal of Jewish education is the bubble to a certain extent, right? But if we want to create knowledgeable Jews in the bubble, there's going to have to be some learning going on. There's going to have to be some measured, standard-based learning going on.
What do you mean by the bubble? Just define that a little bit.
The being away from external influences, right? So being in a
right. I see. I said socially.
When everyone lived, I mean, this is going to be some butchery of Jewish history, right? But when everyone lived, if you were actually a historian, when everyone lived in the shtetl, right? And there wasn't Jewish education past whatever, cheder, right? And unless you were elite, right? And if you weren't elite, you went and you learned a trade. But no one went off the derech. Jewish education wasn't the grounding of what kept people on the derech. The shtetl kept people on the derech, right? Now, absent the shtetl in a broadly assimilated North American, view of the world, how do we recreate the shtetl? So the Haredi community tries to recreate the shtetl in every respect, in education and community and so on. And as you move on the spectrum toward what we would, call modern Orthodox, so there's less of a shtetl communally, culturally, and so on. And so education is really the last anchoring of the shtetl. And to a large extent, that's true. If you keep kids in a social bubble through the end of high school, there's compare that, let's say, with our, denominational brethren in the Reform and Conservative movement, right? There's a pretty, a better than average chance that they will marry a Jew, they'll want to live the life that they kind of understand and know. Even when they go off to university, they still see themselves as apart from the larger community. I mean, anti-Semitism nowadays probably helps that a lot, as it always has, by the way, in Jewish history. But they still see themselves as apart from the broader community, and they end up there. Well, as opposed to if they disengage, after elementary school, or they disengage earlier, then they don't really see themselves as separate.
Right. Yeah, I think that makes sense, and that's a big part of it. And I would say the second part of the goal of our schools is a partnership with others to help us on our mission of engaging our children.
You know what I thought was so interesting? There's this line in the Chesney article. It's why are they grading us? It's our lifestyle. I overheard one high school student lamenting. Another chimed in, I'm not very good in Gemara. I get C's. Right? I've heard that sentiment. How many times, right? Sure. Can we learn the Shema? There's a little manipulation in that, right?
Of course there
right?
is.
If you're an experienced high school teacher, it's not like every high school student is there's not authenticity in every, piece of information that they present.
Of course. And just, again, if the student really feels that way and isn't just saying that to manipulate their parents and the school, then the teacher needs to do a better job at showing what the assessments are there for.
All right. That sounds pretty good. Here's one more thing I wanted to talk about. So this is really interesting. So she said, Jewish leaders must pave the way for a collaborative effort on achieving those goals uniformly throughout the more than 800 Jewish day schools in North America. She means those goals. She means the goals, that she would advocate for of, not having achievement be the only measure of success and so on. So the thought that occurred to me when I read that is, in the 20 years I've been doing this, what Jewish school is not responsive to what parents want? If there was what's stopping us from developing this amazing system that has no tests and it can't be that the curmudgeonly old educator, that was the case when we were in school, right? The curmudgeonly old educators are saying, we're not going to change anything, right? That's not the Jewish education environment that I work in today. Jewish education environment I work in today is parents want apples, and the next day they're apples, right? And parents want their kid to get a higher mark, and often in cases cross out this and you got to get a higher mark, or the mean principal, said I couldn't get a higher mark, or whatever it might be. But most of the time in Jewish education today, the customer is getting what they ask for.
We started off our conversation maybe before. I can't remember if it was before we started recording or not.
Wait, do you agree with that?
Yeah.
You agree with that sentiment?
Yeah.
Because I wonder if parents actually feel that way also.
Yeah.
Like I wonder if they feel like, every educator I work with has the feeling like at the end of the day, it's what the kids want. Like, yeah. I mean, we have like basic structures, and I think there's an implied agreement there, right?
Yeah.
Like the implied agreement is like we have to have structure because if we don't have structure, we're going to devolve into nothing, and there has to be some structure. But like we're going to have the minimum amount of structure necessary while we can still give you whatever you want.
Yeah. There was there was an episode of Lahavdil. There was an episode of Seinfeld where one of the characters, George Costanza, figures out that if
I like how you say that because maybe someone listening to this, like one of the three people, doesn't know what Seinfeld is, which sadly is true now.
Yeah.
Like if it's anyone in our generation.
Anyone under 25?
Yeah, no clue.
Or even 30, I don't know. Anyways, he figures out that if he looks stressed, his boss will think he's working hard and doing a good job. So every time the boss walks by, because one time I think he was eating Kung Pao chicken or something, he was sweating. Oh, wow, he's working so hard. We should give him a raise. But if I would have been rewarded based on effort, I would have bought a lot of Kung Pao chicken and sweated and learned how to I would have wet my shirt to look like I'm schwitzing. And I would have figured out how to game the system because we're being rewarded based on our effort. So I have to look like I have a lot of effort and I'm really learning Lishma. I think that there's a limit to how much we can tell them. Aside from the fact that we want our kids to be religiously and Jewishly engaged, hopefully we're sending them to the school to be able to give them the skills to learn Torah for the rest of their life. And if a Rebbe can't grade their student and test the student, how will the Rebbe, and maybe the test should be more engaging and maybe the test should be alternative and differentiated. In Achinami, of course. But if the Rebbe can't do that and the Mora can't do that, then how's the Mora ever really going to impart in their students the skills to be able to be lifelong learners?
What frustrates you most about your own child's education? Children's, but your oldest.
Today, my children's education, when my child had a teacher who told me, I've been doing this for 40 years and it's worked for 40 years, so it's going to work with your kid. That to me is lazy education. It's saying, because in my mind it's worked, I know it'll work again. When maybe that's true, maybe it's not true. And I happen to have disagreed with that, that sentiment at the time, because research shows us that things evolve and things change, and children, may or may not respond the same way today that they did when she first started teaching. Aside from the fact as an educator that I want all my students to know that I care, I always want to get better, and I always want to improve. And I'm in my 10th year now as a formal educator in the school. I'm a vastly different teacher than I was 10 years ago. Right. I like to think like a vastly better teacher than I was 10 years ago. And if I did something 10 years ago, maybe I made mistakes 10 years ago that I regret. I don't know, but you learn and you get better. And so you got to constantly improve. And so that
when I was at Ramaz, the best teachers, have been doing it for 40 years, but were totally different teachers than when they started.
Yeah.
There was this guy, John Jacoby, who was just unbelievable educator. He's still alive. He's a great educator, I'm sure still. He's not a Ramaz anymore though. But he was an unbelievable educator, and he continually changed and adapted and was just what he was doing I don't even know how long he was doing it. 40, 50 years into what he was doing was totally different than what he had done 10 years before that. Not even at the beginning. Just had was constantly evolving and doing things differently. Which is, of course, the case because children are, especially now, are totally different.
And let me clarify for all the listeners out there that doesn't mean that a teacher should be using Snapchat. And if they don't use Snapchat or Instagram or TikTok, they're a lazy teacher.
No, that's creepy.
Correct. Aside from being creepy, it's just I don't believe that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, in life, you constantly look at yourself and say, how can I be better? How can I
I think a lot of teachers don't get into the profession for that. I think that's the untold story of education. A lot of teachers are choose this job because they're highly educated, and it's a accessible career for them that is generally well paying, right? I mean, you can leave aside having to support a Jewish lifestyle in that, right? That's a whole separate story, let alone a modern Orthodox lifestyle, right? But for an average teacher, it's a generally well paying job with 2 months off in the summer, a whole bunch of breaks during the year. I mean, you add it all up, it's 3 months off a year. And you could get a good system down and you don't really need to do all that much.
Right.
I think a lot of teachers have that, even not even implicit, that explicit sort of approach to education.
That's a mistake.
Right. So how do we get rid of that? Because I have a thought on this, but how do you think we change that?
That's a good question. I don't know. I'd love to hear your thought.
I think it's all money.
Right.
I think that at the end of the day, if you paid teachers, and it has to be competitive salaries it doesn't have to be competitive salaries to hedge funds, right? It just has to be competitive salaries to a decent corporate job. So instead of topping out at 120, let's say high school teachers, $120,000 a year, or 130, which is a well-paying high school, a very well-paying high school, teacher salary should top out at $200,000 a year,
right?
$250,000 a year, right? The kind of job, but you should work 12 months a year,
right?
I had this thought this summer, especially where it's like all of this stress and pressure around the end of school and the start of school. It's all because we have this summer break, and we have this like absolute stopping point where everything has to turn over and start for the next year, right? Like, what if we just went into the summer? Lots of kids would go to camp, but some would stay because they didn't accomplish what they needed to during the year, right? People can still have vacation time. They could still take off at different periods, right? Especially if you didn't structure school with bells and periods and all this antiquated stuff, right?
Sure.
And you just had a 12-month-a-year job, and you made money like you had a 12-month-a-year job. And it was competitive with becoming an accountant, right? Or a family doctor, right? Or whatever it might be, right? It was a competitive profession. I think then you could demand those things.
Right.
Yeah. I'd say.
Yeah. Also self-serving in terms of, I support paying teachers more.
And paying administrators less.
Sure.
Right, because that's where the money goes, right? The money goes to administrators. Like that's, schools are a fortune. Schools run huge budgets, and they go to big development offices, big business offices, big apparatus of management, right? And when you think about it, it's the most backward thing, because if you want to improve education, invest in the primary point of learning, which is the interaction between the teacher and the student. But again, I haven't seen any numbers on this, but this is my conjecture. If you tracked where spending has gone in education, I think there actually is a chart like this somewhere. But if you track where spending in education has gone over the last 20 years, it's into administrators.
Right.
From the university level on down. It's all into this giant administrative structure, and it has not gone to the teachers. I mean, teachers have done better, but not at the pace of where administrators have done.
I one of the first dissertations that I heard when I joined the YU doctoral program was a lady who was researching the topic of why it's such a mistake that we pay our administrators more, so many good teachers go into administration when being a good teacher has no correlation to being a good administrator.
I wouldn't say no correlation, because to the extent that you mentor new teachers and you create that sort of environment, it does. But I understand. Overall,
Malcolm Gladwell writes. I believe it's Malcolm Gladwell writes about how Wayne Gretzky was a terrible coach because he was such a naturally...
They say that in baseball also, that the best hitters are terrible hitting coaches because they never had to think about it.
They never had to think about it. Wayne Gretzky was such a naturally good player that, like, he'll just say, why don't you just score 100 goals? Like, I don't understand. Like, just do it. I also think that in education, being a good educator, there is a lot of natural skill and talent. And so it doesn't... To be a good coach and mentor, some people have it, some people don't, and some people can learn it. But just because you're very talented in the classroom doesn't necessarily mean you'll be a good coach and mentor as an administrator. And whatever else your job as an administrator might entail, a head of school has to be a fundraiser. He has to be a politician. He has to be a public relations expert. And so just because you're an excellent teacher doesn't give you any, validity in those regards. So one of the very first I heard, and this is years ago, so I don't remember the details, but she was talking about this exact premise, that if we paid our teachers more, our great teachers would stay as teachers and not leave to go to administration, when in our school, all our administrators, while they do teach, we're taking away some classes from them. But in some schools, you go to administration, you're leaving the classroom, or you're leaving 90% of the classroom.
It's the story in every school that I've ever encountered, every Jewish day school I've ever encountered.
For sure.
That how do I get you more money? By giving you administrative stuff to do.
Yeah.
Right? I can't get you more money for what you're doing in the classroom, but I really like you. You're really talented in the classroom. So take on Israel guidance, take on student activities, take on this or that, and that's how I get you more money. But meanwhile, all that does is pull away attention from... I have one last question for you.
Sure.
Okay. Here's my question. Do we have too much of the same effort in the Jewish community toward engagement through activities, through, informal learning is a broad term that can mean a lot of different things. So I want to try and define it. I'm going to call it informal learning, but let's say it's anything where the learning is not measured, right? With a test or an assessment or somewhere where we're actually tracking your learning. But there's an event, there's a color war, there's a Shabbaton, there's some event where there's lots of learning taking place, and there's, it's informal. There's no one structuring or tracking it. Are we doubling, tripling, quadrupling our efforts there, and not investing enough in school, right? So what I mean to say is, so an average student, right? Let's just take color war as an example, right? An average student has multiple color wars, right? They have a color war in school. They have a color war in camp. Maybe they have a color war with NCSY, right? They have Shabbatons in school. They have Shabbatons in camp. Or camp is Shabbat. But,
B'nai Akiva,
right. So you have all of these organizations that are doing all of this informal education. And school then also has to take on a whole bunch of informal education.
Right.
So imagine this school day. Right? Imagine that you take your Limudei Kodesh program, right? Apropos of our conversation, you cut it in half, right? And you say half the program is going to be academic and skill-based. And again, you could do it in a differentiated manner where not everyone's becoming, a fluent Hebrew speaker, and not everyone's becoming an expert Gemara learner. It's based on what the student and their parents want and how they want to achieve it. But it's academic. It's fundamentally measured learning, right? And you take the other half of the day and you just give that to NCSY, or give that to B'nai Akiva, or give that to whatever youth organization you want, because they're already doing it. Right. Well, and wouldn't that lower costs too? Right. If schools, why do we have to be in school till 5:30 in the afternoon and have school doing all of these things? Why can't we be in school till 3:00 in the afternoon and have the organizations we're already fundraising for and paying to do these things run these programs, even with the Judaic studies component?
That makes a lot of sense to me. I would support that, because what you're not saying, and what I thought you might say, is let's do less of that. You're not saying that.
No.
You're saying let our schools master education, and let the informal educators master informal education, and let's create a partnership together. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Because what's the biggest tension in school? When you hire an informal educator and you try and put them into a classroom, and then there's this endless tension of they're not giving tests and it's not serious, and the other teacher's serious. And all that's because you have to fill hours of the day, because we have to have this Judaic studies program that occupies X amount of time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know, how it would work exactly. I think the details would need to be hammered out in terms of what it means to have NCSY or B'nai Akiva, or fill in the blank for 2 hours a day, or whatever. It doesn't need to be 2 hours, an hour a day, an hour a week, whatever.
NCSY would love it.
Whatever the school would do, but
they'd jump at that opportunity.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. So that does make a lot of sense, and your question was essentially should our schools invest in being better schools? Yeah.
By the way, you know what else you could get out of that idea? Is you could get more hashkafic diversity in your school.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, most of the hashkafic parameters are around the informal stuff. That's where parents either are comfortable with co-ed or not comfortable with co-ed, and so on. Generally within the learning, Like, I mean, barring like taking let's say my philosophy class out of the equation, like generally within the learning, like mostly the same, right? Like your skills you're learning, so maybe one school stresses Hebrew language, maybe one school stresses Gemara, but like it's generally the same, right? And you could imagine a scenario where kids go to different programs based on where they feel hashkafically comfortable.
Yeah.
Right? Like in Israel, whether you go to Ezra or you go to Bnei Akiva or something like that, right?
Yeah, if we had 4 options of 4 different programs that were hashkafically somewhat consistent with the school, that would make a lot of sense. I do think that a lot of the magic of these informal educational institutions comes from their role model volunteers, call it advisors, madrichim.
Yeah.
And it would be contingent on engagement of those parties. Like, meaning it, if you get the head of NCSY or the head of B'nai Akiva to come in and do something, that's not the magic. That would be changing what they are successful at. So assuming you could logistically actually run that and successfully, create that type of program, I think that would improve our schools pretty drastically. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Good, we've solved it.
Okay.
You want to wrap?
Let's wrap it up.
That was awesome. Thanks, Mom. See you later.